So while most of the world is focused on what's going on in Ukraine, and for good reason, there's another war that could kick off any day now. It's the fight between Iran and Israel. Now, it's not really fair to say that this war could start anytime soon, because technically they've kind of been involved in this shadow war for a few decades. But the strikes and the intensity between the two nations does seem to be increasing, and there's a reason for that. All of a sudden, there's kind of a timeline to take action. Now, over the last few months, Israel's been accused of carrying out multiple strikes against Iranian-backed groups in Syria, as well as targets inside of Iran. I'm going to separate these out, and I'm sure somebody's going to get upset, but strikes inside of Syria come across to me as very different than strikes inside of Iran. So Syria is still involved in a very, very bloody war, and there are a ton of different factions there, and the United States is involved, and Russia's involved, and multiple other nations. I have a hard time looking at what Israel is doing in Syria and saying that it's drastically different than what the United States is doing, targeting ISIS groups, right? Israel is targeting groups in Syria that threaten to do their country harm. The United States is continuing to hunt down Islamic State cells in Syria. There's too fine of a line to separate there for me. But in terms of Israeli strikes inside of Iran, that's a really big deal. And I feel like we gloss over it so quickly. And I'm sure people are going to say, but what about all of these different places that the U.S. has carried out strikes over the last 20 years? And yeah, I got it. I think the U.S. has probably conducted more drone strikes in other nations that we're not at war with, and anyone else is probably not even close, right? And there's something, at least to me, that comes across differently from striking targets inside of a nation that are not tied to that government, like Islamic State targets in Iraq, for instance, or Taliban groups using the Afghan-Pakistan border that the U.S. would strike anytime over the last 20 years. That, to me, feels different than targeting the military infrastructure of a sovereign nation like Iran. That's, again, it's a really big deal. And that leads to the why. Why is Israel striking inside of Iran? And that is tied pretty heavily to the Iranian nuclear program. So at a high level, Iran does not have nuclear weapons today, and they've publicly said they have no desire to pursue the development of nuclear weapons. But some experts have said that the levels to which they're enriching uranium, around the 60% mark, would be very close to what they would need to actually build a bomb, and is well above what they would need for civilian purposes. But the big news over the last couple weeks is that at the end of February, the United Nations put out a report that said Iran had enriched uranium to 83.7%, which is quite a bit above that 60% threshold they supposedly were staying around. Now, Iran says that these are just fluctuations in their process, that it's going to happen. It's a spike, essentially, that they're not actually enriching most of their uranium to that point. Skeptics, on the other hand, have said that this is evidence that Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapon and that they are much, much closer than we had anticipated. The CIA director put out a statement just after this came out saying that this shows Iran is just a few weeks away. If they make the decision that they want a nuclear weapon, which the CIA director said there's no evidence they've made that decision, but if they did, in just a matter of a couple weeks, they would have a usable nuclear weapon. Now, there's a lot of countries around the world that don't really want to see this. Israel is top of that chart. Israel is very concerned that Iran would acquire and potentially threaten or even use a nuclear weapon against them. So when I was talking about a timeline all of a sudden being on the table, this is it. If Iran is that close to a nuclear weapon, how long does Israel or their supporters or their allies around the world have to act before this becomes a reality? I wish I could say that meant just doubling down on negotiations, and there is some positive in that realm. The head of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association from the United Nations, said that they have an open line of communication with Iran, and Iran is suggesting that they're going to open the door to more inspections. So there is some positive in that realm, but there's also some very aggressive language coming out of not just Israel, but the United States as well. Just a week before this report came out, the U.S. ambassador to Israel said, quote, "As President Biden has said, we will not stand by and watch Iran get a nuclear weapon, number one. Number two, he said, all options are on the table. Number three, Israel can and should do whatever they need to deal with it, and we've got their back." Layer on top of that in January, the United States and Israel carried out some of the largest joint military exercises in our two nations' history, and you can see how people inside of Israel that are eyeing the military option might look at some of these remarks and some of these actions and think that they've got the full might of the U.S. military behind them should they choose to act against Iran. And just last week, Ken Klippenstein put out an article in The Intercept talking about this detailed Pentagon plan for war with Iran, suggesting that the amount of work that went into this was more than just your standard off-the-shelf plan that's developed in the event of contingencies around the world. So real quickly there, and it's hard to tell if these are three individual pieces of evidence or in any way grouped together, but we have Israel wanting to act in their own self-defense, avoiding Iran becoming a nuclear power. Then we have the United States saying that they're going to back Israel. And now all of a sudden there's this Pentagon plan of direct U.S. military action against Iran. My personal opinion, I don't think the U.S. public has very much interest at all in getting back into a major war in the Middle East. I mean, good luck explaining to someone in rural Tennessee why Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon is a direct threat to them. We did this just 20 years ago. In the aftermath of 9/11, we'd experienced this traumatic event here in the United States. We were hearing all about terrorist attacks. We were hearing about weapons of mass destruction. And then this target, Iraq, with their weapons of mass destruction that they wouldn't let the inspectors see and all that was laid out in front of us. And this idea of a preemptive strike was presented. We have to hit them before they can hit us. And it makes sense. We crossed the berm into Iraq, and those weapons of mass destruction, the main reason we went into that war in the first place, to protect Americans back home and citizens all around the world, those weapons of mass destruction weren't there. So the idea of a preemptive strike might carry the day in Israel. I can understand that. It's a direct threat to their nation if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, but I don't know that that's going to pass with the American public. Another big issue here, because everything is interconnected, the main military backer of Israel is the United States. The main military backer of Iran is Russia. And it turns out right now that the United States and Russia are rather preoccupied with what's going on in Eastern Europe. In a different time, different situation, I can see how these two countries, in their planning for potential war, would expect some sort of heavy contribution from their primary backers, be it humanitarian assistance, maybe intelligence gathering, even lethal aid. But I'm not sure that's a given right now. For Russia, yes, Iran is a strategic ally, but how much would they be willing to pour into that fight while they have a fight right on their border that's taken up a ton of manpower and resources? And for the United States, in terms of what we could provide Israel, I gotta think that it would be quite a bit less than if this war in Ukraine wasn't happening. You can't have multiple priorities getting all the attention. But it's something worth keeping an eye on and worth keeping up with, because if that timeline really is just a couple weeks, like the CIA director said, to when Iran could acquire a nuclear weapon, that means that we could wake up someday later this week to find out that Israel has carried out a large-scale military operation targeting the Iranian nuclear facilities. Then we're falling headfirst into a regional conflict where, like it or not, the U.S. still has a lot of interests. But that's all I got for now. I'll see y'all next time.